The morning had started like so many others, quiet, pale sunlight resting on the surface of the lake like a held breath. Daniel walked slowly along the familiar path, the gravel crunching softly beneath his shoes. Beside him, Max padded at half his old pace, gray fur dusted with dew, leash loose between them. This walk had become their ritual since Max grew older, shorter, slower, filled with pauses. They reached the edge of the lake, where the water was smooth and still. Daniel stopped, expecting Max to sniff the grass or settle down. But Max didn't move. Instead, the old dog froze. His body stiffened, tail low, eyes locked on the water. A low whine slipped from his chest, soft, uncertain, almost pleading. Daniel frowned and tugged the leash gently. "Come on, buddy," he murmured. Max didn't budge. He took a step closer to the lake and began to tremble, paws planted as if rooted. Then he barked once. Sharp. Out of character. His ears tilted forward, his gaze unblinking, fixed on the lake's surface as though something there refused to let him look away. Daniel's chest tightened. He scanned the water for ripples, birds, anything. Nothing. Just the lake and their reflections. As Daniel shifted his stance, the angle changed. The reflection sharpened. His breath caught when he noticed something wasn't right. Not with Max, but with what the water was showing him. His heart started to pound, because what Max was staring at wasn't just the lake. And what the dog sensed was far from ordinary. Before we continue, remember to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching dog stories. And tell me, where are you watching from? The morning arrived gently. No alarms. No rush. Just a thin veil of light stretching over the lake, pale and silver, as if the day itself hadn't fully decided to begin. Daniel stepped out of his car and closed the door softly. The sound felt too loud in the stillness. He paused for a moment, breathing in the air. It smelled like damp earth and cold water, familiar, grounding. Beside him, Max waited. The old dog stood patiently, gray creeping through his once dark muzzle, chest rising and falling a little slower than it used to. His ears twitched at distant sounds. A bird somewhere in the trees, the faint hum of a road far away, but he stayed close. Daniel clipped the leash on. "All right," he said quietly. "Just a short one today." Max's tail gave a gentle wag. Not fast. Not excited. Just content. They started down the gravel path together. Each step crunched softly beneath Daniel's shoes. Max's paws followed in an uneven rhythm, 3 steady steps. Then a pause. Daniel adjusted without thinking, slowing his pace to match. He'd learned how to walk this way over the past year. Shorter strides. More patience. More pauses. The lake came into view through the trees. Still. Wide. Unmoving. It reflected the sky so clearly it felt less like water and more like a second world lying flat beneath their feet. Daniel always liked that about this place. It felt honest. Uncomplicated. They'd been coming here for years. Back when Max was younger, they jogged this path. Back when mornings felt endless instead of borrowed. Back when Daniel believed he understood his own thoughts better than he did now. Those memories drifted through him as they walked. Not heavy. Just present. Max stopped to sniff the edge of the trail. His nose hovered low, breath steady. Daniel waited, watching the subtle movements he'd come to read instinctively. The way Max's ears angled slightly forward. The way his tail stayed relaxed. Healthy curiosity. Nothing more. A breeze passed over the lake. It carried the faint smell of algae and wet wood. The surface rippled once, then settled again. Somewhere across the water, a duck shifted, sending a quiet echo outward. Daniel exhaled slowly. This was why he came here. Why they came here. The world felt smaller at the lake. Manageable. They reached their usual spot. A narrow opening where the path widened just enough to stand without blocking anyone else. A low wooden post sat near the edge, weathered and cracked. Daniel often leaned against it while Max rested. He stopped. Max didn't. The leash tightened slightly as the dog took 2 steps forward, then froze. Daniel noticed it immediately. Not because Max pulled, but because he didn't move at all. Max's posture changed. His head lifted. His spine stiffened. His tail lowered just a fraction. Daniel frowned. "Hey," he murmured. "Easy, buddy." Max didn't respond. His eyes were fixed on the lake. Not scanning. Not wandering. Locked. Daniel followed his gaze. The water looked the same as always. Smooth. Empty. No sudden ripples. No boats. No birds close enough to matter. "See something?" Daniel asked. Max's ears shifted forward again. His chest rose with a deeper breath. A soft sound slipped from his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a growl. Something uncertain. Daniel's hand tightened on the leash. He felt it then. That small, familiar ripple of unease. The kind you couldn't explain because nothing was technically wrong. He took a step closer to Max. The dog didn't turn. Didn't blink. "Max!" Daniel said a little firmer now. Nothing. The lake reflected them both. Man and dog standing side by side, stretched slightly by the angle of the light. Daniel caught his own shape in the water without really looking at it. He was more focused on Max. The dog's legs trembled. Just barely. Daniel crouched down beside him, careful not to startle him. He placed a hand gently on Max's shoulder. The fur felt cool and a little damp from the morning air. "You okay?" he whispered. Max let out a quiet whine. It vibrated through his chest, low and steady, like a warning meant only for the two of them. Daniel swallowed. Max wasn't a nervous dog. Never had been. Even now, with his age showing in his joints and eyes, his temperament stayed calm. Predictable. This wasn't that. Daniel stood slowly. He scanned the area again, the shoreline, the trees, the path behind them. A jogger passed far off, headphones in, unaware. Everything felt normal. Too normal. "Come on," Daniel said gently, giving the leash a light tug. "Let's sit for a minute." Max didn't follow. Instead, he stepped forward another inch, closer to the water, and planted his paws. Firm. Intentional. Then he barked. Once. Sharp. Clear. Gone as quickly as it came. Daniel's heart jumped. He hadn't heard Max bark like that in months. "Hey, hey," Daniel said quickly, his voice low. "It's okay. It's just the lake." Max's eyes never left the surface. The breeze passed again, colder this time. The reflection on the water shifted slightly as Daniel moved, and for a brief moment something about it felt off. He couldn't say why. Only that his chest tightened, and his breath caught, just enough for him to notice. Max let out another soft whine. Longer now. Daniel stared at the lake. And for the first time that morning the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. Felt like it was waiting. He had no way of knowing it yet. But this ordinary walk, this familiar place, was about to show him something he hadn't been ready to see. And Max somehow already had. Daniel stayed where he was. Still. Quiet. The lake stretched out in front of them, smooth again, as if it hadn't just shifted something inside him. The reflection returned to normal sky, trees, pale morning light. Nothing out of place. And yet, Max remained locked in position. His paws were braced now, toes splayed slightly against the dirt. The leash hung with a steady tension between them, not strained but purposeful. His ears stood forward rigid, catching sounds Daniel couldn't hear. Daniel watched him closely. Years of living together had trained him to notice the small things, the language Max spoke without words, the difference between curiosity and concern, between alertness and fear. This was neither. It was something deeper. Max's breathing slowed, then deepened. Each inhale came through his nose, controlled, deliberate. His eyes didn't flicker across the surface of the water, the way they might if he were tracking movement. They stayed fixed on one place, a point just off-center in the lake, close to where the reflection of the trees darkened the water. Daniel shifted his weight. The gravel crunched softly. Max reacted instantly. His head tilted a fraction, not toward Daniel but closer to the water. His tail dipped lower, stiff now, unmoving. "Hey," Daniel whispered. "I'm right here." Max didn't look at him. Daniel felt a faint chill move through his arms. He crouched again, slower this time. Careful. He placed his hand near Max's chest, not touching yet, just enough for the dog to sense him. Max let out another sound. Not a bark. Not a whine. Something in between. A warning or a plea. Daniel's throat tightened. "What is it?" he murmured. The lake answered with silence. No ripples. No sudden motion. Just stillness. Daniel straightened and stepped slightly to the side, following Max's line of sight more deliberately now. He shaded his eyes against the growing light. First he saw nothing. Then he noticed the way the reflection behaved. The surface wasn't perfectly flat anymore. It wasn't moving, not really, but the light seemed uneven, as though the water were holding something just beneath it. Daniel leaned forward. His reflection came into clearer focus. Tall. Slouched slightly. Shoulders heavier than he remembered. Beside him, Max's reflection stood smaller, warped by the angle. His head stretched, long eyes dark. Daniel swallowed and looked away. "This is ridiculous," he said quietly to himself. He tugged the leash again. Gently. "Come on, Max. Let's go back." Max resisted. Not by pulling. By grounding himself. His muscles tensed beneath his fur, steady and firm, as though he were anchoring himself to the earth. Daniel felt the leash vibrate faintly with the effort. "Max," he said more firmly now. "Hey." The dog finally moved. Just not the way Daniel expected. He stepped sideways, placing himself directly in front of Daniel, blocking the path to the water. Daniel froze. That was new. Max had never done that before. Not once. Even when Daniel stepped too close to a steep drop or icy edge in the past, Max would warn him with a bark or nudge, never physically block him. But now, Max stood squarely between Daniel and the lake. His stance was wide, protective. His head lowered slightly, eyes still flicking back to the water, then up to Daniel just for a second. A check-in. Daniel felt his breath catch. "You don't want me going closer," he whispered. Max didn't respond, but his tail twitched once, tight and controlled. Daniel felt a strange warmth rise behind his eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. He rubbed his face with one hand, exhaling slowly. "It's just water," he said. "Nothing's happening." The words sounded thin. Max's ears flicked again. His gaze returned fully to the lake. His body trembled. Not violently, but enough for Daniel to notice the effort it took for him to stay still. Daniel crouched beside him again. This time, he rested his hand on Max's shoulder. The dog leaned into the touch just slightly. A quiet acknowledgement, but didn't relax. "Okay," Daniel said softly. "Okay. I see you." The breeze returned. Cooler now. It brushed across Daniel's neck, raised goosebumps on his arms. The water shifted just enough to distort the reflections again. Trees stretching unnaturally long, sky breaking apart into pale fragments. And for a fleeting moment, Daniel saw something in the water that made his stomach tighten. Not a shape. Not a figure. An absence. A place where the reflection didn't quite match. His pulse quickened. He straightened abruptly, scanning the water again. Faster now, more urgently. Still nothing obvious. No movement. No sound. He laughed under his breath. A short, nervous sound. "Get a grip," he muttered. Max barked again. 2 short bursts this time. Daniel flinched. "Okay," he said quickly. Okay. He stepped back instinctively. The moment he did, Max relaxed just a little. Enough to notice. Daniel stared at him. Realization crept in slowly, settling heavy in his chest. Max wasn't reacting to the lake alone. He was reacting to Daniel's position. Where he stood. How close he was. Daniel took another cautious step back. Max exhaled, long and shaky, but his eyes never left the water. Daniel's heart pounded. "What are you seeing?" he whispered. Max didn't answer. He just stood there, old and steady and unyielding, guarding something Daniel hadn't yet understood. The morning light brightened. Birds began to stir in the trees. Life moved on around them. But Max remained fixed in that moment, staring into the lake as if it were a mirror showing something Daniel had tried very hard not to look at. And for the first time Daniel wondered if the dog wasn't seeing the water at all. Daniel forced himself to breathe. Slow, measured, in through the nose, out through the mouth. The lake hadn't changed. Not really. The path behind them was still there. The trees still rustled softly in the breeze. Somewhere farther down the trail voices drifted, two people talking, laughing about something ordinary. Normal sounds. Normal life. Daniel clung to that. This is just one of those days, he said quietly, more to himself than to Max. You're tired. That's all. Max didn't respond. He remained planted between Daniel and the water, posture firm, eyes unwavering. His ears stayed angled forward, alert to something Daniel couldn't hear or see. Daniel straightened his shoulders. He hated this feeling, the sense of being watched by his own thoughts. The unease that rose when silence lingered too long. He'd come here for calm, not whatever this was. He tugged the leash again, gently but with intention. Come on, he said. Let's head back. Max resisted. Again, not with force. With resolve. Daniel sighed. Max, he said, a hint of frustration slipping through despite himself. You're okay. There's nothing there. The dog's tail flicked once. His body remained tense. Daniel glanced down at Max's graying face, the cloudiness just beginning to touch his eyes. A thought he didn't like pressed forward, quiet, insistent. He's old. The word carried guilt with it. Old meant unpredictable. Old meant confusion sometimes. Old meant moments like this, moments where instincts misfired, where the world didn't line up the way it used to. Daniel hated thinking that way, but it was easier than the alternative. He crouched again and reached for Max's collar, intending to guide him gently away. The second his fingers brushed the fabric, Max stiffened further. A low sound vibrated in his chest. Not angry, not afraid. Warning. Daniel froze. Hey, he said softly. I'm not mad. I just want to go home. Max's head turned slightly, not fully, just enough for one dark eye to glance up at him. The look stopped Daniel cold. It wasn't confusion. It was clarity. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He stood abruptly and stepped away, dragging his hand through his hair. His pulse beat loudly in his ears. You're fine, he said, pacing a few steps back and forth. We're both fine. The lake reflected him again, pacing now restless. He caught sight of his own posture and barely recognized it. His shoulders were hunched, his movements sharp. He looked tired. More than tired. Daniel frowned and turned away from the water. He hadn't slept well the night before. Or the night before that. Sleep came in fragments now, shallow, easily broken. He told himself it was stress. Work. Age. Life catching up. Nothing more. Max's behavior pressed against that fragile explanation. Daniel crouched down again, this time in front of Max. He held the leash loosely, keeping his voice calm. Listen, he said. We've been doing this walk for years. You know this place. Max's ears flicked, but he didn't relax. There's nothing here, Daniel continued. No danger. No problem. The words felt rehearsed, like something he'd said before. Max inhaled deeply. His nose flared. Daniel watched as the dog leaned forward slightly, not toward the water but toward Daniel as if checking him. His head tilted just a fraction, studying his face. Daniel felt exposed. I'm okay, he whispered. The lie settled between them. Max's tail remained low. His eyes searched Daniel's face again, then returned to the lake. His stance didn't change. Daniel felt irritation rise, sharp and misplaced. Come on, he said more firmly. You're not a guard dog. You're just my dog. The moment the words left his mouth, regret followed. Max didn't flinch, but something in his posture shifted. He stepped closer to Daniel, closing the space between them, and pressed his shoulder lightly against Daniel's leg. Not pushing, just touching, grounding him. Daniel's breath stuttered. He reached down automatically and rested his hand on Max's back. The warmth there steadied him, just enough to slow his racing thoughts. "Sorry," he murmured. "I didn't mean that." Max stayed close, still blocking the water, still staring. Daniel stood again, feeling the weight of the moment settle deeper now. He looked around once more, harder this time. The shoreline, the path, the water's edge. Nothing. He laughed quietly, a hollow sound. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I'm standing here arguing with a senior dog." Max let out a soft huff through his nose. Daniel almost smiled. Almost. He checked his watch. They'd been standing there longer than he realized. "I've got things to do," he said, more defensively now. "We can't just stand here all morning." Max didn't move. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. A familiar pressure built behind them, the kind that came when he tried too hard not to feel something. He pushed it down the way he always did. He took a step toward the lake. Just one. Max reacted instantly. His body tensed sharply, and he let out a single urgent bark, louder this time. His paws slid forward as he repositioned himself directly in front of Daniel again, blocking him. Daniel stopped short. His heart pounded. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." The frustration drained out of him, replaced by something heavier. Doubt. He stared at Max, really stared now, at the tension in his muscles, the unwavering focus, the deliberate way he held his ground despite his age. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't stubbornness. This was intention. Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time, he allowed the thought he'd been avoiding to rise fully to the surface. What if Max wasn't wrong? What if Daniel was the one misreading the moment, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging something about himself he wasn't ready to face yet? The lake remained silent. The reflection waited. And Max stood between Daniel and the water, refusing to let him look away any longer. The air felt heavier now. Not colder. Not darker. Just weighted. Daniel stood still, his foot hovering where he'd meant to step, then slowly set it back where it had been. The gravel shifted beneath his shoe, the sound unnaturally loud in his ears. Max didn't relax. If anything, his stance grew firmer. His legs were braced wide now, chest squared, body angled slightly sideways, a quiet, deliberate barrier. His tail stayed low and rigid, not tucked, not loose. Controlled. Daniel's pulse thudded in his throat. "Okay," he said softly. "I hear you." Max's ears flicked backward for half a second, acknowledging the sound, then forward again, locked on the lake. Daniel exhaled and rubbed his hands together, as if warming them. His fingers trembled more than he liked. "Let's just sit," he tried. "Just for a minute." He shifted his weight and moved toward the wooden post near the water. Max reacted instantly. A sharp whine cut through the quiet, higher this time, edged with urgency. He stepped forward again, blocking Daniel's path with surprising speed for a dog his age. "No," Daniel whispered, startled. Max's body trembled now visibly. Not from fear. From effort. Holding ground. Daniel felt something twist painfully in his chest. "Hey," he said, kneeling quickly. "You're going to hurt yourself." Max didn't look at him. He barked again. One bark. Then another. Short. Controlled. Each one felt like punctuation. Daniel froze, his knee hovering just above the ground. His breath came shallow now, sharp little pulls of air that didn't quite satisfy. "Max," he said. The dog finally turned his head and looked at him fully. Their eyes met, and in that moment something shifted. There was no panic in Max's gaze. No confusion. No fear. Only focus. A steady, unwavering awareness that made Daniel feel suddenly inexplicably small. Daniel swallowed hard and rose back to his feet. "All right," he murmured. "All right. I'm not moving." The words settled the air between them. Max exhaled, long and shaky, but didn't lower his guard. His eyes flicked back to the water, then returned briefly to Daniel's face, checking. Daniel stayed where he was. Seconds passed. Then minutes. The sounds of the morning crept back in slowly. Leaves rustling, distant footsteps, a bird calling somewhere behind them. The world resumed its quiet rhythm, as if nothing unusual were happening at all. Daniel felt absurd standing there. And yet, he couldn't make himself move. He stared at the lake again. The surface shimmered faintly now as the sun climbed higher. The reflections stretched and softened, bending the shapes of trees and sky. Daniel noticed the place Max kept staring at. The same spot. Not the shoreline. Not the center. Just off to the side, where the water darkened slightly as though deeper there. Daniel's throat tightened. He took a half step backward. Max relaxed just a fraction. Daniel noticed. He took another step back. Max's shoulders dropped slightly. His breathing steadied, though his eyes never left the lake. Understanding crept in slowly. "This is about me," Daniel whispered. The words felt strange. Exposed. Max's ears flicked toward him again. Daniel pressed his lips together, jaw tightening. He felt a dull ache settle behind his ribs, familiar, unwelcome. He'd been standing too close to the edge for weeks now. Not just here. Everywhere. He hadn't planned anything. Hadn't named it. But the pull had been there, subtle, persistent. The idea that quiet places held answers. That stillness could offer relief. He told himself he just liked the lake. That was easier. Max whined softly again. Daniel's eyes burned. "I wasn't going to do anything," he said, his voice low. "I just wanted to think." The words rang hollow even to him. Max shifted his weight, stepping closer. He pressed his side firmly against Daniel's leg, anchoring him. His fur was warm, solid, real. Daniel placed a hand on Max's back, fingers curling into the thick fur. He felt the steady rhythm of the dog's breathing beneath his palm. It grounded him. "I'm okay," Daniel whispered again. This time the lie didn't land. Max remained tense. Another bark broke the quiet, sharper now, etched with strain. The sound echoed faintly off the water's surface, then disappeared. Daniel flinched. "Okay," he said quickly. "Okay. I get it." He took 2 deliberate steps away from the lake. Max followed, just enough to stay between Daniel and the water, then stopped again, holding his position. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions surge through him. Embarrassment. Relief. Grief. He laughed softly, shaking his head. "You stubborn old man," he murmured. Max didn't react. He just stood there, trembling, resolute, as if his entire purpose in that moment was to remain exactly where he was. Daniel's laughter faded. His eyes drifted to the water one last time. The reflection stared back. Not distorted now. Clear. He saw himself standing there, pale, tired, shoulders heavy with something he'd refused to name. He looked older than he felt. Or maybe he felt older than he'd admitted. The sight made his chest ache. He turned away. The moment he did, Max finally moved. Just slightly. Enough to let his muscles ease. Daniel exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you," he whispered. Max leaned into his leg again, solid and warm. They stood like that for a long moment. Man and dog, facing away from the water now. The lake quiet behind them, patient, unchanged. But something had shifted. Something important. Max hadn't moved because he couldn't. Because leaving his post meant risking something Daniel hadn't yet been brave enough to admit. And in his quiet, unwavering refusal, Max had held the line. Until Daniel was ready to step back from it himself. They stood facing away from the lake. For a while, neither of them moved. The world continued its quiet rhythm around them. Leaves whispering overhead, distant footsteps on the path, the soft hum of morning settling fully into place. Daniel focused on Max's warmth against his leg, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It helped. But the pull didn't disappear. It lingered behind him. Patient. Daniel swallowed and turned his head slightly, just enough to let the lake slip back into his peripheral vision. He didn't step closer. He didn't move his feet. Max noticed instantly. His ears flicked back. Then forward again. A silent question. I'm not going anywhere, Daniel said softly. I just want to look. Max stayed pressed to his leg, unmoving. Daniel turned his shoulders slowly, keeping one hand on Max's back as if tethering himself to the ground. He faced the water again, cautiously, deliberately, stopping well short of the edge. The lake greeted him with calm. The surface had smoothed again, reflecting the sky more clearly now that the sun had climbed higher. Pale blue stretched across the water, broken by the dark shapes of trees along the far shore. Daniel's reflection appeared once more. This time he didn't look away. He studied it. He saw the way his shoulders slumped forward, as if bracing against an invisible weight. The faint lines etched around his eyes. The tension in his jaw he'd stopped noticing. Beside him, Max's reflection stood solid and steady, slightly warped by the water but unmistakable. A small, faithful shape anchored close. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He leaned forward just a fraction. The reflection sharpened. And then he saw it. Not something new. Something familiar. In the water, the version of himself staring back looked distant, as if he were watching from behind glass. Present but not fully there. Daniel's breath caught. It wasn't the lake showing him anything mystical or strange. It was showing him the truth he'd been skirting around for months. The quiet exhaustion. The way still places felt tempting instead of restful. The comfort he'd found in standing near edges, physical and emotional, because they asked nothing of him. The reflection didn't accuse. It simply showed. Daniel straightened abruptly, heart pounding. His hand tightened in Max's fur. "Oh," he whispered. Max shifted closer, his shoulder pressing firmly into Daniel's leg. A grounding weight. Real. Unyielding. Daniel closed his eyes. Images surfaced uninvited. Late nights sitting alone at the kitchen table, lights off. Long drives with no destination. The way silence sometimes felt too heavy, and sometimes felt like relief. He hadn't planned anything, but he hadn't pulled away either. That was the part he'd refused to see. Daniel opened his eyes again. The reflection waited. "I didn't realize," he murmured. Max let out a quiet huff, breath warm against Daniel's knee. Daniel crouched down slowly, bringing himself closer to Max's level without moving closer to the lake. He rested his forehead briefly against the dog's head, careful of his aging joints. Max accepted the contact immediately. Steady. Present. "I didn't know I looked like that," Daniel said quietly. The words trembled. Max's tail flicked once, slow, deliberate. Daniel lifted his head and looked back at the lake one more time. He noticed something else now, the way the water reflected not just his body but the space around him. Open. Wide. Unmoving. The lake didn't pull at him anymore. It mirrored him. And Max had noticed long before Daniel did. "You saw it," Daniel whispered. "You saw me." Max remained still, eyes returning briefly to the water, then back to Daniel. Another check-in. Daniel nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. "I see it too." He stood, carefully, and took a deliberate step back from the water. Max relaxed visibly. His shoulders lowered. His breathing evened out. The trembling eased from his legs, though he stayed close just in case. Daniel felt a strange lightness settle in his chest. Not happiness. Relief. The kind that comes from naming something instead of running from it. He turned fully away from the lake now and faced the path behind them. The trees looked different from this angle. Less imposing, more welcoming. The trail curved gently forward, leading back toward the parking lot, back toward ordinary life. Max followed his movement immediately, stepping in sync with him. Daniel smiled faintly. "Let's go home," he said. Max wagged his tail once, slow, deliberate, as if agreeing to something important. They started down the path together. Daniel kept his pace measured, matching Max's stride. With each step away from the lake, the weight in his chest loosened slightly. He glanced down at Max. The dog walked with his head high now, ears relaxed, tail swinging gently behind him. The tension that had defined his posture earlier was gone. "You didn't even hesitate," Daniel said quietly. "You just knew." Max didn't look up. He didn't need to. Daniel felt warmth spread behind his eyes again, but this time it didn't threaten to overwhelm him. He blinked it back, breathing deeply. The lake disappeared behind the trees. Daniel didn't look back. By the time they reached the car, the morning had fully arrived. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, dappling the ground in soft patterns. Somewhere nearby a child laughed. Life continued. Daniel opened the car door and waited as Max climbed in carefully, settling onto the seat with a soft sigh. Daniel paused before closing the door, resting his hand briefly on Max's shoulder. "Thank you," he said again. Max leaned into the touch. Daniel shut the door gently and walked around to the driver's side. As he got in, he caught his reflection briefly in the window. It looked different. Still tired. Still human. But present. Daniel started the engine and pulled out of the lot, the road stretching ahead of them. Behind them the lake remained calm, reflective, unchanged. But Daniel carried something new with him now. Awareness. And the quiet certainty that when he couldn't see himself clearly, Max always would. The drive home was quiet. Not awkward. Not heavy. Just quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, letting the rhythm of the road steady him. Max lay on the passenger seat, curled carefully, his breathing slow and even. Every so often Daniel glanced over just to make sure. Max's eyes were open, watching. They reached the house, a small familiar place with a narrow porch and a wind chime that clicked softly when the breeze caught it. Daniel parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment longer than necessary. The stillness felt different here. Safer. "All right," Daniel said quietly. "Let's get you inside." Max shifted, joints stiff, then hopped down carefully. Daniel moved slowly, matching him, letting Max set the pace. Inside, the house smelled like coffee grounds and old wood, comforting, lived in. Daniel filled Max's water bowl and watched him drink. The sound grounded him. Simple. Real. "You want breakfast?" Daniel asked. Max wagged his tail once. Daniel smiled faintly and set the bowl down. As Max ate, Daniel leaned against the counter and finally allowed himself to feel the aftermath of the morning. The shaking came then. Subtle. Uncontrollable. He gripped the edge of the counter until it passed. Max finished eating and walked over, pressing his nose gently into Daniel's thigh. "A check-in." "I'm okay," Daniel whispered. This time it was closer to the truth. Later that afternoon the phone rang. Daniel almost didn't answer it. He stared at the screen, watching the caller ID glow softly. His sister's name. He hesitated, then picked up. "Hey," he said. There was a pause on the other end. "I had a feeling," she said quietly, "that today might be hard." Daniel closed his eyes. "How did you?" "You've been pulling away," she said. "And you never pull away unless something's wrong." Daniel swallowed. They talked for a long time. About nothing at first. About everything eventually. About exhaustion and loneliness and the way days sometimes blurred together until it felt like standing still. He didn't say everything, but he said enough. When the call ended, Daniel sat on the couch, phone resting in his lap. Max climbed up beside him, slow, careful, and settled against his side with a heavy sigh. Daniel rested his hand on Max's back. "I think you saved me today," he said softly. Max's tail thumped once against the cushion. That evening Daniel made a decision. It wasn't dramatic. No grand declarations. No sudden clarity. Just a quiet choice. The next morning he sat in a doctor's office that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee. He filled out forms slowly, deliberately, checking boxes he'd avoided before. When the nurse called his name, his chest tightened, then eased. "I'm here because my dog wouldn't let me stand too close to a lake," he said with a small, embarrassed smile. The doctor didn't laugh. She nodded instead. "That happens more often than you'd think," she said. Daniel felt something loosen inside him. Days turned into weeks. Routine settled in, appointments, conversations, small changes. Daniel walked Max at different places now, parks with benches, paths with railings, places that felt open without feeling endless. Max adjusted easily. He always did. One afternoon weeks later they returned to the lake. Not the same spot. A different entrance farther from the edge. Daniel had chosen it carefully. Max stepped out of the car and paused, nose lifting, taking in the familiar scent. His ears flicked once toward the water, then relaxed. Daniel watched him closely. "You okay?" he asked. Max wagged his tail. They walked together, staying on the path. Daniel felt the lake beside them rather than in front of them this time. Present but not demanding. They stopped at a bench. Daniel sat. Max lay at his feet. The water shimmered in the distance, reflecting the sky just as it always had. It looked the same. Daniel didn't feel the pull. He felt grateful. He looked down at Max, resting peacefully, eyes half closed. "You knew before I did," Daniel said quietly. "You didn't panic. You didn't bark for help. You just stayed." Max opened one eye, glanced up at him, then closed it again. Daniel smiled. The rescue hadn't looked like a rescue. No sirens. No hands pulling him back. Just an old dog refusing to move. Holding the line when Daniel couldn't. As the sun dipped lower, casting warm light across the lake, Daniel felt something settle gently inside him. Not an ending, but a beginning. He stood, stretched, and clipped Max's leash back on. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Max rose carefully and wagged his tail. They walked away together. And this time the lake stayed behind them. Calm, reflective, content to simply exist. Just like Daniel was learning to do. Healing didn't arrive all at once. It came quietly. In pieces. In mornings that felt a little less heavy when Daniel opened his eyes. In nights where sleep stayed just a bit longer than it used to. In the way the house no longer felt so loud when it was silent. Max noticed first. He always did. Daniel began waking earlier, not with the anxious jolt that used to pull him from sleep, but with a steady awareness of the day waiting for him. Max would already be awake, lying near the bedroom door, tail thumping softly when Daniel stirred. "Good morning," Daniel would murmur. Max's ears would lift. His eyes would brighten. They moved through their days together with a new rhythm. Still slow, still measured, but intentional. Daniel cooked more. Simple meals. He opened windows, letting air move through the house. He called his sister once a week, sometimes more. He kept his appointments. And Max stayed close. Always within reach. Always watching. Their walks changed too. They still went outside every morning, but the routes were different now. Tree-lined streets with steady sidewalks. Parks where children played and dogs passed at a respectful distance. Benches placed thoughtfully along the way. Max set the pace. Daniel let him. Some days they walked farther than expected. Other days they turned back early. There was no pressure either way. Daniel learned to listen. Not just to Max, but to himself. He learned the signs. The tightness in his chest when he pushed too hard. The fatigue that crept in when he ignored his own limits. The calm that settled when he allowed himself to rest without guilt. Max mirrored every shift. When Daniel slowed, Max relaxed. When Daniel breathed deeply, Max's tail wagged. When Daniel laughed, really laughed, Max's ears perked as if surprised but pleased. One afternoon, Daniel found himself sitting on the floor, sorting through old photographs he'd avoided for years. The light slanted softly through the window, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. Max lay beside him, chin resting on his paws. Daniel picked up a photo of Max as a puppy. Ears too big for his head, eyes bright and curious. "You were a handful," Daniel said quietly. Max lifted his head, tail thumping once. Daniel smiled and shook his head. "I didn't know how much I needed you back then," he said. "I really didn't." Max shifted closer, resting his head against Daniel's leg. The contact felt grounding, steady. That night, Daniel slept deeply. Dreamless. Weeks passed. Max's age showed more clearly now. Stiff mornings, slower rises, longer rests. Daniel adjusted without thinking, helping him up steps, lifting him gently into the car when needed. There was no resentment in it. Only gratitude. "You've taken care of me long enough," Daniel whispered one evening as he helped Max onto his bed. It's my turn. Max sighed contentedly and curled up, trusting completely. Daniel lay beside him, one hand resting lightly on Max's side, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. It anchored him. There were still hard days. Days when the quiet pressed in again. Days when the lake crept back into his thoughts, not as a pull, but as a reminder of how close he'd come to losing himself. On those days, Max stayed especially close. He followed Daniel from room to room, pausing when Daniel paused, sitting when Daniel sat. If Daniel stood too long staring out a window, Max would nudge his leg gently. A reminder. Here. Now. Daniel listened. One morning, as autumn edged into the air, Daniel noticed something new. Max was graying more quickly around the eyes. His movement slower still. But his presence felt stronger than ever. You're getting old, Daniel said softly, crouching to rub Max's chest. Max's tail wagged. Yeah, Daniel added, smiling. So am I guess. The thought didn't scare him anymore. Aging felt different now. It meant staying, not fading. One afternoon, Daniel took Max to the vet for a routine checkup. The clinic smelled like disinfectant and treats. Max waited patiently, leaning against Daniel's leg. He's a good dog, the vet said, listening to Max's heart. Very attuned. Daniel nodded. He saved me, he said simply. The vet looked up, meeting his eyes. I believe that, she said. Daniel felt warmth spread through his chest. That evening they sat on the porch together, watching the sky shift from blue to gold to soft gray. The wind chime clicked gently, punctuating the quiet. Max rested his head on Daniel's foot. Daniel sipped his tea and breathed in the cool air. Healing didn't feel like fixing something broken anymore. It felt like learning to live alongside the cracks, to acknowledge them, to tend to them. Max shifted, pressing closer. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's back, fingers curling into familiar fur. We're doing okay, he whispered. Max's tail thumped once. And in that small, steady moment, man and dog sitting together as the day faded, healing didn't feel like an abstract idea. It felt real, shared, ongoing. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt ready to keep going, not alone but together. Time continued the way it always does. Quietly, unapologetically. The seasons shifted around Daniel and Max, almost without asking. Autumn leaned into winter. Winter softened into spring. And through it all, their days stayed simple, intentional. Max moved slower now. His walks were shorter, his naps longer. Sometimes he paused at the doorway before stepping outside, as if gathering himself. Daniel never rushed him. He learned the language of those pauses, when to wait, when to help, when to simply sit beside him. Love adjusted. One evening, Daniel found himself back at the lake. Not by accident. He'd thought about it for days before deciding. He chose a bench far from the edge, one with a railing behind it and a clear, solid path beneath his feet. The lake lay off to the side, visible but no longer central. Max stood beside him, leash loose. He sniffed the air, ears flicking briefly toward the water. Then he looked up at Daniel. Checking. I'm okay, Daniel said softly. This time the words held. Max seemed to consider this, then lowered himself carefully onto the ground at Daniel's feet. He circled once, slow and deliberate, and settled with a deep sigh. Daniel sat on the bench. They stayed there together, watching the light dance across the water's surface. It shimmered the same way it always had, calm, reflective, honest. Daniel felt no pull, only appreciation. He reached down and rested his hand on Max's head, fingers tracing the familiar shape of his skull, the softness of fur worn thin by time. You changed everything, Daniel whispered. Max's tail thumped faintly against the ground. Daniel smiled. He thought back to that morning, the quiet walk, the sudden tension, the old dog who refused to move. He understood it more clearly now. Max hadn't been afraid of the lake. He'd been protecting Daniel from disappearing into himself. The realization settled warmly in his chest. They didn't stay long. Max tired easily these days, and Daniel respected that. When he stood, Max rose carefully and followed, leaning lightly into Daniel's leg as they walked back to the car. At home, the house welcomed them with familiar creaks and soft light. Daniel helped Max onto his bed, tucking a blanket around him the way he always did now. "You rest," Daniel said. "I'll be right here." Max's eyes fluttered closed. Daniel sat nearby, reading quietly, glancing up every few minutes just to watch Max breathe. Each rise and fall felt like a gift. Later that night, Daniel lay in bed listening to the gentle sounds of the house. The wind chime clicked softly on the porch. Somewhere in the distance, a car passed. Max slept on his bed nearby. Daniel thought about forever, not as a promise of endless time, but as something else entirely. Forever was the morning routines, the quiet check-ins, the way Max always knew when to stay close. Forever was built from ordinary moments stacked gently on top of one another. Weeks later, on a morning that felt no different from any other, Max didn't get up right away. Daniel noticed immediately. He knelt beside him, heart steady but attentive. Max opened his eyes, tail giving a faint wag. "I know," Daniel whispered. He stayed there for a long time, hand resting on Max's chest, feeling the slow, familiar rhythm beneath his palm. The house was quiet, peaceful. Max's breathing slowed, then settled, then stopped. Daniel didn't panic. He stayed. He pressed his forehead gently to Max's and closed his eyes, letting the grief arrive the way healing had, quietly in pieces. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." The days after were hard, but they were not empty. Daniel felt Max everywhere, in the routines they'd built, in the pauses he still honored, in the instinct to stop and breathe before stepping too close to the edge of anything. The lake remained. So did the lessons. Months later, Daniel returned once more, alone this time, and sat on the same bench. He watched the water ripple softly under the afternoon light. He smiled, because he understood now. Some bonds don't end. They settle into you. They become part of how you move through the world, how you notice, how you stay. Daniel stood and turned away from the lake, feeling steady, grounded, present. Max had taught him that. And even now, especially now, the bond remained unbreakable. Forever.